All right. Well, thank you everyone for all of that. And I've got your introductions in the chat. And since it's a recording, there's no need to introduce yourselves when you speak, but please do take a point of information in your speeches and also indicate how you'd like to receive points of information, whether that be visually, audibly, or in the chat. Without further ado, I'd like to invite the Prime Minister to begin the debate.
Hello, my visible and audible. So cool. Okay, I'll take POIs verbally, please. Okay. A little tired, but my speech will begin in three, two, one. First on the model, and then our main push, which is why competition is very good for these players. I think that number one on the model is likely to happen well, because I think that it's likely to be local sports authorities, looking like from in the NHL, like league authorities or like national football leagues, for example, like regulating this, ensuring that there can be cooperation between professional clubs and youth academies, with no exclusive contracts in which profession some youth academies are seen as feeder like academies to like specific clubs, right? I think that insofar this is true, I think that these like authorities are likely to like deny, like for example, competitive eligibility to certain, professional clubs that don't comply with this. I think this is likely to be done well because I think that these clubs likely do not want to be structurally locked out of competing or like be penalized by their, like league authority. And like it applies to like a variety of sports. It looks like, in baseball, like in hockey, there's often like league authorities that like dictate, rules of competition, rules of like how you like interact. I think that two pieces of characterization, as to why there are large inequalities from status quo. I think number one is that there often are very, very good youth academies, and then there's a lot of other youth academies which are seen as relatively more mid or like worse. Because there's the one or two best youth academies of significant resource advantage. This looks like, legacy players like that they've, been like historically developing players that are very, very good. It looks like more capacity or like very unique coaching strategy that has been empirically successful. It looks like a lot of prestige attributed to these youth academies within these specific like cities or like metropolitan regions or like specific countries. Looks like people like these youth academies have a monopoly in the market in which these academies produce very good players generally. And I think these best people, I think the second piece of characterization, the best people from these best academies become locked into contracts because there probably are like exclusive like this. I think these clubs or sorry these very, very good youth academies I think probably want like large like profit returns to fund, their players, to fund their like the continuation of their prestige, right? And for this reason they're probably likely to sign exclusive youth agreements given the profit incentive to do so. I think that insofar as this is true, I think that I think you at a youth academy that's very prestigious and have a lot of exclusive recruitment agreements, probably, probably paint like going into contracted professional clubs as a result of like this like these agreements, like they probably paint this as like very good to your players, right? Looks like, for example, like a lot of coaches or managers telling players that are very good that it's good to go like, enter these exclusive youth recruitment agreements. Like when you're starting off as a player, you're probably very naive. You're probably not familiar with the, demographic, like the landscape of like the like whatever sports you're in. If you're planning to go professional, you probably are very likely to be manipulated. And I think that when there's one option that is socialized, that like your, an academy or your coaches tell you to go into, I think that you're more likely to lean into it and accept this, right? I think you have much less agency, I think, on like in status quo. I think that on the government counterfactual, I think you have more choice or agency insofar as you probably aren't socializing to pursuing this one option, aren't locked into like contracts, right? So like often like even if like I think that there's still incentive. I think even if like these best players don't want me like go into these academies, I think that there's probably incentive for them to be like highly pressurized into this like option, right? I think that insofar as it's true, I think that in the government counterfactual, we have more freedom to choose contracts. It probably leads to a lot more competition. I think that there's two mechanisms of competition here. Number one is you probably have higher quality contracts between like academies, right? Like when there's the best players from these best clubs being like that have very, very good like for example like stats. I think that academy like a professional clubs are likely to compete for these players, right? And when you have like when you don't have exclusive contracting, there's more options for these clubs, or more player options for these clubs to like compete with. So I think that these clubs uniquely like offer, I think, like more diverse or like more competitive contracts. I think this leads to higher quality contracts in which, when you have really poor poor like pay, very poor like training conditions, these players have the agency to like choose like other clubs above it. I think that exclusive contracting means that these players are again locked into one option that they cannot like opt out of. And I think that the second thing that this is like this like I think implicates is there's more competitive incentives for academies or like for academies or like clubs because I think that when the big clubs of top recruit spots are taken from like recruits from top academies, let's crowd out smaller academies from like competing with this, right? I think that like it's like because this derive like takes like like money and prestige away from smaller academies when these smaller academies are structurally locked out of like entering big clubs. I think that and so if these big clubs allow for like smaller academies to compete by not offering exclusive contracts to these like large prestigious academies. It probably leads to smaller academies to be more likely to develop like innovative like training strategies like better like community development or like more better like more unique like aspects in training for players or, like good things that have a better like much clearer ROI and then probably like the potentially develop better players so like because these players presumably can actually access these like top like these top clubs in the government counterfactual as opposed to I think to the opposition counterfactual they're structurally locked out of like entering clubs because all like the prestigious
Point.
clubs are predisposed to like access them, right? I think the impact here is twofold. I think number one is just like the young people's lives just get a lot better when you have more agency that opt into a variety of contracts. You get better conditions. I think that there can be a lot of traumatic events in sports, such as injuries or being forced to train so hard. That probably leads to a lot of suffering. A lot of young people choose or consider like professional sports as a career. I think that we ought to make their lives better insofar they choose to go into clubs and they probably take years of training in these youth academies. I think we ought to give them better lives and giving them by giving them agency to choose between contracts. I think that number two, but I think that on the second impact, so the market demographic probably gets a little more competitive, meaning that I think that a lot of I think that the conditions for players are likely to get more I think safe and like better quality because these for like clubs
Point.
presumably more compete with like each other for like better players. I'll take a quick POI. Anders, what's up?
Yeah, this mechanism maybe works for the top 5% of players who have lots of bids for them, but for the vast majority of players who might only get one bid because they're not that good, it's better if all the clubs don't spend all their money on the top players and instead spend some money more equally across all the
Yeah.
different players.
I'm unsure why, if you're insofar as you choose to at a club, you like sign an exclusive contract with like a youth academy. These youth academies are probably unlikely to put their like shittiest players into these like exclusive things. I think that like I think that there are probably club expectations for like the quality of players that like they put in like these exclusive contracting, right? That's probably the point of exclusive contracting is better players like guaranteed. I think that the comparative, I think okay, quickly on macro weighing, like why do we care about sports like as a whole? I think that like sports is probably a lot better when there are interesting stories in sports. It looks like underdog teams that have the potential to compete because there isn't like an elite like club like taking all the good players, for example. And it looks like like underdog players being able to access like larger like teams and having like good player stories like POV like you hop into the Lakers even if you're like from like a really poor background or something. I think the rise to fame narrative is very I think very interesting. I think we ought to care about this because I think it probably I think for the individual it's probably more enjoyable to watch this, but also I think for players there's I think high amount of utility seeing your personal success. I think if Gov can prove that by having more player diversity within these clubs, and like when like that giving structural access to privilege, I think like or like to like youth academies is probably bad. I think that we probably win this debate. OG.
Thanks so much for that speech, Prime Minister. I'd now like to invite the Leader of Opposition to begin their team's case.
Hi, can I check I'm visible and audible?
Yep, you are.
Thank you. I'll take my POIs verbally. In an incredibly competitive and saturated industry, we would rather that you have a guaranteed pipeline in order to secure your career. A few rebuttals to OG then. The first thing I want to deal with is what the likely comparative is going to be. OG tells you about things like regulation by sports leagues to ensure that players do not get abused. We think this is likely to be equivalent on both sides. Sports leagues probably play an equivalent role on both ends. The second thing that PM tells you is about cooperation between youth academies and professional clubs. What we want to push to you here is what the actual comparative is going to be. We think there is going to be a free-for-all drafting system where these like professional clubs now scout through things like youth games, for instance, rather than going to the youth academy itself. I'll talk later about why this is likely to result in a worse drafting system, but we don't think that the system of cooperation that PM tries to push is very likely, especially because it is not mechanized very well. The second rebuttal then on the whether or not this fixes the inequality of youth academies. Now, PM tells you that because certain youth academies are likely to get locked into agreements, this means that you like further the elitism. The easy response here is that we think that inequality is likely to exist on both ends anyway, because elite youth academies are just going to have more resources on both sides. They're going to have better training regimes on both sides. What we will concede here is that it is likely that in this agreement between the youth academies and the professional clubs, it is likely that the highest ranking sports clubs will look to these elite academies, but we think that lower tier academies will still get deals with other sports clubs. We're willing to trade this off because we think on both ends there is an equivalent level of inequality in the sense that these people from lower tier youth academies would likely never break into these elite sports clubs anyway. The third thing that PM tells you is about the freedom to choose your contract. She tells you that young players are naive and that they have no agency. The first mitigation I'll point out here is that these like young players probably have a great deal of consideration as to whether or not they want to join this club in the first place, because they probably know that these clubs have a direct pipeline to this like sports club. It is very likely that if they want to join a particular sports club, they will seek to join the youth academy that is affiliated with it. We think there is a very strong sense of choice here. But the second like response here is that we think that if Gov wants to argue that these players are too young to make these decisions as to their eventual contracts, we think that joining a youth academy in the first place is already a huge decision. They are committing themselves to a sporting career. They are committing themselves to, for example, giving up their academics. It is unclear then why the contract is the tipping point to when they are unable to consent into these things. We don't think Gov makes it clear. Last rebuttal then on whether or not you get higher quality contracts, because Gov tells you that more competition leads to better contracts. We think the important context here is that sports is an incredibly saturated and incredibly competitive industry. We think that you don't need to make your contracts competitive on either side of the house because these academies know that you have an infinite supply of players anyway. You don't need to offer them high pay because someone else will always be willing to join the club for a lower pay. The flip we're going to make here is that it is likely to get better contracts on our side of the house simply because youth academies have more negotiating power to like deal with the contracts that these sports clubs are offering to their students. There are two reasons why youth academies have incentive to do this. The first is because they want to secure a better career for their graduates. They want their graduates to eventually have a sustainable career where they are not felt by injuries, so it promotes the reputation of their sports club. But the second is that they also want to attract more people to join their academies. So if they can promise people that they will give them good and fair contracts with another professional club in the future, more people are likely to join them. We think for these reasons, contracts will be better on our side of the house. Moving on to my argument then on why we guarantee the career of young athletes. Again, the context here is that sports has very high barrier to entry for three reasons. The first is that it's incredibly saturated. This means that it's very hard to get scouted into a professional club simply because there are so many young athletes looking to join these clubs in the first place. Second is that it requires a lot of early commitment. You have to start training when you're extremely young. You have to necessarily give up other life paths. For example, you have to leave school to join a youth academy instead. The last is that there are just limited resources. Youth academies have limited spots. Professional clubs have even more limited spots. It is very hard to break into these things. Now, we think that the implication of this is that many athletes that enter these academies in the first place have no guarantee of a future career. This is true for two reasons. The first is things like internal competition, which necessarily means that you're competing with other people within your academy to get contracts. But the second is that getting scouted is usually extremely hard if you do not have an exclusive contract with a professional club. Because note the counterfactual here. It is that these scouts go to watch youth games and they scout them from there instead of going to the academy and scouting directly. The reason why scouting from things like watching games is extremely bad for these athletes is true for two reasons. The first is that it's often a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. You get scouted based on your performance in one game or a few games. This means that you have limited chances to prove your worth. But secondly, it's also that many people within the academy itself often don't get a chance to participate in these games because of the internal competition that we talked about earlier. If you don't happen to be at the tournament where the scout is watching, you simply will not get scouted. We think this is terrible. The mechanism then of how we provide a stronger guarantee on our side is threefold. The first is that you get a guaranteed pipeline into these sports academies. But the second is that the professional clubs also take in more people from your academy in the first place. This is because their exclusive contract is likely to mean that they take in 10 people from your academy as opposed to 2 or 5. This means that you lessen the internal competition that we talked about earlier. You ensure that more people within these academies get the chances to join these clubs. But the last and most important mechanism is that scouting is done directly through the academy rather than through the games themselves. So what this looks like is, for example, the scouts will go and watch your training. They will observe these young players for a series of like weeks or months to get a more holistic idea of what their standard is. This means that you get more chances to prove yourself to the scouts. But secondly, we think it also relies on things like trainer feedback. They will go to your trainers and they will ask them who they think is promising and should get scouted. This means that you get a more holistic point of scouting because, for example, trainers can tell you things about their character. Before I move on, I'll take a POI from closing. 3, 2, 1. Okay. It means that, for example, trainers can tell you this person is extremely hardworking and we think they have a lot of potential. So even if they're not performing like insane goals in games right now, we think they have the potential to do so in the future, and therefore you should scout them. We think this is good at the point at which athletes, first of all, get scouted more, but secondly, get scouted based on more holistic mechanisms. The impact of this then, when we ensure the higher certainty of career, note that this is the most important impact of the debate, because we think that the most important thing for these athletes is to join any club at all. This is important because you have already sunk so much into a sporting career. At the point at which you are unable to find a contract with a professional club, that's the point all of your training was for nothing. This is more important than freedom, because most athletes are looking for security in their younger years rather than freedom. They just want a contract so that they can continue to stay in this industry. We also think the weighing here is on logical priority. You need a job in any club at all to eventually break into professional sports in the first place. This is true for 2 reasons. The first is that you need a contract, you need money so that you can continue staying in the sport, so you can continue training. But the second thing is that a contract, any contract at all, no matter in what professional club, allows you to create a reputation. You can appear at professional games, you can start building a reputation for yourself. This means that you can eventually get traded. This means that you can eventually use it as a stepping stone to join better clubs. We think that the intuition pump here is that when Michael Jordan joined the Chicago Bulls was not a very good club. We think it was the presence of Michael Jordan that made it into a good club in the first place. So we do not think that it's necessary for young athletes to join the best professional leagues in this instance. All of these reasons,
Thanks for that speech. I also would encourage teams to offer points of information, and invite the Deputy Prime Minister to continue their team's case.
Amazing. Am I audible?
Yeah.
Great. 3, 2. Oh, sorry, 1 second. 3, 2, 1. I'm going to do some engage with OO, but I think once we rebuild our case, it should be quite clear that our case implicitly weighs over OO quite clearly. Let's talk about OO's case. OO's case is entirely on the metric of player welfare, what's in the interest of these players. There's a couple unfounded assertions they're going to have to prove in DLO, which is actually why it's better for these middle ground players to sort of struggle at getting a sports career, which will likely be only short term as opposed to working any other thing that's probably decently good for them. I'm not sure whether it's true. They do believe that's true, but I think they just largely don't. And there's some issues with the rest of their case. I think a lot of the issue with their case is it's not super clear whether their case is comparative. I think you can still have deals, you can still have cooperation, you can still have like preferential treatment, you can still talk to trainers, you can still talk to coaches, you can still scout in academies on our side of the house. Is you just can't do exclusive deals. I think you can do a lot of things their side relies on our side of the house. I don't think we give a reason why it's not likely to be true. But I also just think that they run this case on guaranteed careers, but I just don't know why this is true. I don't know why you're likely to get contracts if you're not one of the best on these youth academies. I don't know why if you're in a middle of the road person in youth academy, you're likely to get an exclusive contract, or why it's likely to be such a good thing for you. I think it's something that has to put on. But I think importantly, we beat them on the metric of player welfare. Why? I think we obviously went on autonomy and choice, and I think we give them that choice. But notably, I don't think choice is important on principle that much. I think most important about choice is that it makes the clubs have to compete to give these players the best thing. CO says, what they'll pay them the most. I think this is plausible, but I think notably it is often in the economic interest of the clubs and in the economic interest of these players to not care the most about money, but to care the most about things that allow them to earn the most money in the long term. What is that? I think this means safer training, and this means better facilities, and this means better food, and this means better staff, and this means people who like more careful academies who will help you, train at a better rate for longer and remain safe. Look at Victor Wembanyama. Look at his training regimen. It is fucking ridiculous. This is a club that cares about him. I think when you have the ability to choose, you're more likely to choose a club that cares. The issue is that when they compare to this, on their side of the house, when there is a locked-in welfare, when there is a norm pushed by the very psychologically powerful leaders in the academies that you will send this contract, you will be locked in these deals. I think the players can't pick the places that are best for them. Players know what they value. They know what's good for their own welfare, and when they make these choices, they will be better. And the clubs will have to compete to offer the best facilities, the best service, the best care for players. I think this means fewer people get burnt out and get injured, and this means fewer people die in accidents which occur in the very high intensity training things that happens in the clubs. I think this stuff matters to player welfare. But no, okay, yeah, sure, I'll take Sia.
Yeah, like the minimum salary for a footballer is many millions of dollars a year. If a club is making a many million investment, they're probably going to get the best training regimen possible, even if it's not the biggest club ever.
I just don't know why it's true because they're not competing, right? They don't have to do this. There's no competitive incentive to do this. They don't have a incentive to change their training incentives at all or to make the facilities the best thing. It's just not true. Why would they spend the amount of money to renovate this entire thing when they can just not, and they have exclusive deals with the club, the training academies? But I don't think this matters. I don't think this is the important part of our case. The most important part of our case is competition in the sport itself, not in terms of player welfare. Let's talk about this. We give two reasons why this is true. The first thing is there's just more competition between clubs. I think this is pretty clear. When it is true that in the status quo, the best clubs can get the best players guaranteed, regardless of anything else, I think this means there is just a lack of access to good players by the smaller clubs or by even medium-sized clubs. The obvious retort is, on your side, they will just pay a lot of money for these players. I think the issue is that it's often strategic, you can see this in many of the Alberta hockey teams, to spend a lot of your money getting one really good player on a medium-sized team and having that player carry you to success. This is the thing a lot of sports teams do, meaning on our side of the house, when there's no exclusive contracts, far more teams, be they medium-sized or small, have access to top-of-the-line players who bring dynamism to the game. One of the reasons people like watching Alberta hockey is because the players are more dynamic. They have a team that has an extremely good dynamic player, Connor McDavid, and he helps make the team work, and he'll bring some spark to the game. Makes me fucking watch hockey. And I think this matters. I think this is part of why people watch the sport. I think what happens in opposition, we have the best talent being soaked up by a couple of clubs, time after time after time, you don't get that same competition. You don't get that same spark that brings viewers to the game and makes them care. Obviously, this is more important than the amount of money the players are making. So the second reason we get more competition in sports is I think it's a little more subtle. This is about the academies themselves. I think if it is true that the big clubs take their best recruiting spots but from these big training academies, I think it, again, crowds out smaller training academies. I think when you don't have this, when you have a more free market of where the people from academies go, I think you actually allow smaller academies to become strategic for them to invest in innovative training methods, to invest in very, very good prospects, and to give them and send them to the best teams, the best clubs. I think when this occurs, I think it brings more fans, it brings more fame to these academies. I think when the international sporting community sees that one of the top clubs gets a recruit from some previously unheard of training academy, and this brings money, and this brings fame to that academy. What does this mean? I think this means that more academies are going to try more things and innovate more. This means more academies are willing to, more academies are actually just competing with each other to innovate the sport. I think the second thing that fans care about, as opposed to just having competition in sport or having interesting games happen in sport, they care about innovation in sport. They care about games not being the same as what it was 10 years ago or 5 years ago or 2 years ago. They care about developing new things. When Steph Curry invented the three-pointer spam strategy in basketball, people fucking love that shit. People ate that shit up. But now people don't like it. Now people are like, that's boring because he said it before. People like it when you innovate. And it's very, very important. And so I think when we get more innovative training academies or more innovative tactics and we drill in players from a younger age, I think this gets you more innovation in sport. Why do we win this debate? Obviously, we beat OO on the clash of player welfare, and it's probably better if players have access to better facilities, better food, better training, better care for their young, developing, very often very disproportionately very tall or very abnormal body shapes. I think they need a lot of care and attention for this. I think you get better. You get those much better on our side, which is much more important degree of player welfare than getting paid more money. I think the best players like to be paid enough money on both sides. I think people who are unlitigated contracts are probably not going to get enough pay on up to make it really worth it. The more important thing by win is we just get a more competitive, more interesting game to watch. This is like people care about sports, is about the competition, not knowing who's going to win the match, not having a stagnant league, and having a league that both innovates in who wins and the different strategies teams use to win. For this reason, it is a quite clear OG ballot.
Hi, can I just check that everyone can hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. I'll be taking verbal pure, preferably from closing. I think the problem with OG is that they don't really want to engage with the frame that my first speaker has already told. And the fact of the matter is, professional clubs, as much as they love the game, as much as they love the sport, they fundamentally operate based on a monetary incentive. They ultimately operate based on how much money they have at that point in time and how willing or how much return that they think they will see on their investment into a certain youth academy. By this metric, then, this means that the comparative on OG is actually extremely flawed, right? Because I think what OG wants to posit to you, they want to posit to you two main things. The first thing they want to tell you is that, oh, no, professional clubs an incentive to want to work together with your youth academies, have an incentive to like help you, right? I think the problem with this with free for all draft system is that the economic analysis here is is missing, right? Insofar as there is no guarantee that your players will even want to enter these professional clubs, that you are not the first pick. These professional clubs then have no incentive to even want to put in money into you. They have no incentive to want to train you, because this means that all of their effort has the potential to being wasted insofar as your player chooses to join another club instead of you. Because of this lack of guarantee, it is unlikely that there is an incentive for professional clubs to even want to help these youth academies to begin with. The second thing that they tell you here is that, oh no, but then it doesn't really it doesn't get better on your side either, because what happens when the student is not the best player in the club? Right? I think that this problem is worse on OG insofar as the way that you are scouted in OG is problematic to begin with. When you only have one shot for you to show your worth, when you only have that one chance people that good, when you competition, all your effort is going to mean even less. I think on our side, at the very least, you get a more holistic way of scouting when professional clubs have an active incentive to go to youth academies and judge people's potential consistently, not based off a one-off show that OG has, right? The next thing they want to tell you here is that they get better welfare, better choice, because clubs want to compete. I think it is unclear why competition is exclusive to their side, right? I think on our side, clubs presumably have to compete anyways. Youth academies presumably have to compete with each other anyways to get better training regimes, to actually provide better training for their potential athletes, right? Because if they don't compete, they also can because on our side, right, I think youth academies presumably care about their reputation as well. Right, so I'm unsure why competition is exclusive to their side. I think moving on then, I have really one main substantive here on increased funding, and I want you to know how this will nicely clash with OG's idea on how they get better training or whatever. The context here is very simple, right? I think currently in youth academies, there are limited resources not because these youth academies don't care about its students, but rather they lack the capacity to improve training. Things like lack of money, things like the lack of like proper coaches, lack of expertise. I think these are things that fundamentally mean that youth academies simply don't have the resources to actually help its students get better. The mechanism here is then very, very simple, right? We told you that on our side, we get greater involvement from professional clubs into youth academies because now we ensure that they are directly involved. This means that there is a certainty from youth academies, from professional clubs, that these people in these youth academies will be your players. This means that there is a guaranteed return on the investment that you're likely to put into them. And here's where you actually get more involvement. But the second tier to this is that once you invested money into these youth academies by buying these contracts, this means that now you have to ensure that these potential athletes come to your team. You have to ensure that they're good so that you can basically get a payoff from the effort that you've put in. What this means then is that professional clubs are more willing to step in and help. This means they're likely to provide you more money, financially, but also you're also likely to get more training, better training regimes, because now they're more likely to give you their expertise. They're more likely to provide you better coaches. They're more likely to actually be involved in the kind of training that these youth academies are likely to do. And here's where we clash very nicely with OG, right? Because we tell you that on our side, training becomes even better, especially when your professional clubs send in trainers in order to groom, in order to fill in the gaps that the professional team needs at that point in time. So if a soccer team needs a goalie, this means that they are likely to go to youth academies and start training people to be goalies. Get more dynamic, better sports when these enter into the professional sports industry, given that now you are actually filling in the gaps that the team needs. You're likely to get a better game overall. So we actually take the benefit of OG here, right? I think the next thing I want to tell you here, and here's why we directly this is like the implicit response to OG here, right? We told you that exclusiveness is actually necessary, right? Because on our side, more sports actually open up from our academy. Because now sports aren't divided between multiple academies. But the second thing here, you actually put in more attention onto these clubs. Because scouts have to attend more trainings, they have a closer relationship with your trainer. We think ultimately this is a good thing. Second thing here, we told you that small clubs actually get better players, right? Because note here that better players that get scouted by better clubs will eventually go there anyways. So the delta here is that players from elite academies who don't get scouted on sports clubs, and has players from elite academies who don't get scouted by sports clubs. And it's symmetric because ultimately you can still go. But the third thing here, right, we take that innovative training methods, because on our side, training methods become far better, it's far more tailored to what the team needs at a point in time. I think overall the sports becomes better, right? The next thing I want to talk about then is that on our side, this youth academies actually now have money to take in more players. And here's where we actually co-opt the inclusivity argument as well. Because right now, the reason why youth academies don't want to take in more players is because they are unsure that they're able to cope. They don't want to take in people who they are unsure will actually be able to become really, really good athletes in the future, right? On our side, when you give them money to do so, they're more willing to take in players on scholarships. They're less likely to put conditions or stringent conditions in recruiting its players. We think that's ultimately a good thing. Sure, CG.
Yeah, so clearly in your big agency that you have full control over, there will be multiple goalies, multiple strikers, multiple midfielders. In a world in which you no longer have certainty as regards to these goalies that you want, would you not expand your scope of who you want to employ?
No, I don't think that's the case, right? Because on our side, perhaps the professional clubs will actually train multiple goalies, multiple strikers. But ultimately, this system comes down to first priority, right? So they will pick the best goalie to enter their team. And then afterwards, if the players who are not chosen by this professional club can still go to other places to begin with. On our side, at the very least, we get guaranteed certainty. Players are more incentivized to work hard. They actually see a path that they can succeed in. So just the weighing here is very, very simple, right? I think based on likelihood, we provide you the economic analysis as to why professional clubs want to get more involved on our side. I think here we just co-opt we co-opt their cooperation point quite obviously. But I think the second thing here, we told you that freedom or agency is less important because you can actually have that freedom and agency in the future once your career is a little bit more stable. We told you that the first few years after you debut is most integral to how secure you are, whether or not you can step out as a sports player. I think this is extremely important given the amount of time that players already put into actually entering the sports industry in deciding that the life path is going to be like this. But we think security weighs over all else, because insofar as you are struggling for money, you don't have a job anymore, you feel like you wasted all your time, we think agency matters less in this debate. So even if you want to say that perhaps we have no agency and choice at all, which I want to again remind you that OG has not really proved why, but I think ultimately we think that security still wins this debate for all these reasons.
Great. Thanks so much for that speech. And now I'd like to invite the Gov member to begin their team's case.
Visible, audible?
What?
Um, sorry, visible and audible. Am I? Just
So are you asking me?
yes, I am.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. Sorry. TJ is going to enter this debate by doing two things. Firstly, we're going to vertically extend on OG and explain all of the holes that they have had in their case. The second thing we're going to do is we're going to flip the vast majority of OO's claims. That's how we're going to win the debate. 3 contributions today, and I'll integrate, obviously, my framing within it. Firstly, why this oftentimes breaks the stagnancy that exists within a lot of training academies. Realize that there is obviously a hierarchy, as a lot of teams have recognized. We actually explain how you break that stagnancy. And note that this is incredibly important because this is something that is asserted in OG, but they don't actually really explain. We provide you a more compelling analysis. And this will also flip OO insofar as a lot of their benefits are contingent on, for example, a lot of clubs not wanting to go to smaller academies. Firstly, why is there a stagnancy? We are going to actually explain to you why exactly in the status quo it is so stagnant. Firstly, because the talent pipeline is incredibly unequal, and note that these academies have obviously been around for incredibly long periods of time, and throughout which they have oftentimes built their hierarchy and built their position far more and more. And the very obvious observation is that these are also uniquely inaccessible for the best academies are oftentimes uniquely inaccessible for 3 reasons. Firstly, they're geographically incredibly inaccessible. Think about how they are oftentimes in the most prominent and most rich areas. A lot of poorer individuals cannot have access to this. Secondly, they require incredibly high fees for you to attend. But thirdly, insofar as you are competing against, for example, the son of another incredibly famous, let's say, football artist, footballer, this means that oftentimes is incredibly dependent on things like connections. This means that they are not only oftentimes incredibly rigid standards, in order for you to actually enter the better academy, is incredibly inaccessible for the vast majority of individuals. Why is it likely that we actually change this on our side? Because firstly, when you don't actually have exclusive contracts, academies are no longer bound to one club. And not why exactly are they even likely to diversify in the very first place? This answers the question of opening half. Because clubs have 2 observations. Because they themselves fear that this one singular place is not enough. So obviously, if they really need a striker, and let's say this academy just isn't producing good strikers, like you can obviously go to another academy. But the second observation is that they fear the competition from other clubs in taking the people from this one academy. They themselves are under competition to actually go and find new people. And this means that they most likely are going to do things like diversify. What does this mean? This is like going to smaller academies and actually going to take a look at them. And this is incredibly important in actually helping them. Realize why this is much better than what was previously explained. PM explains that smaller clubs can innovate and outcompete. Problem is that this is incredibly uncertain, especially since there's an obviously lower amount of resources that these smaller clubs can have. Now we actually explain how big clubs have the incentive to go to smaller academies. This is far more direct, far more significant, and this is probably something that actually wins us around. And second, this is obviously flips OO. The second observation then is that clubs just don't need to go insofar as clubs also no longer need to go and get the individuals from this one specific academy, there's more insecurity generated within the academy, especially since their PR has probably said stuff about this is a guaranteed chance for you to enter a club. Oftentimes, insofar as they are no longer able to uphold that, they get far more desperate. What does this mean in terms of the club? This means that the number of people, the people who will normally be deterred by the low prospects of entering a smaller academy, are far more willing to join these smaller academies. And note, this means far more potential talent, and this does directly empower them in terms of the amount of talent available that they have. This is oftentimes additionally why exactly a lot of a lot more clubs are far more incentivized to even go to there because they know there's a far greater talent pool there. All right then. Second extension then, I'm going to prove why exactly it's bad for players, and this is where I'm going to flip the argument about how where O says that this incentivizes clubs. Sorry, this incentivizes academies to take in more people. We're going to flip this and explain to you why this is an incredibly bad thing. Why is this an incredibly terrible thing? Because the incredibly clear observation is that now, insofar as you have this additional idea of it being an exclusive contract, you have clubs have additional incentives and clubs have additional capacity when they actually try to take in players, and they are oftentimes likely to act on this. What is this incentive? It's the fact that you know that there are people who will normally waitlist, but you know that will actually be a incredibly big boon to a lot of other clubs, a lot of other academies. And in which case, you obviously don't want to give your rival an incredibly good player that just isn't fit for your own team. This means that players that you will normally reject or waitlist, you will take these people in, but the problem is that you then lock them into your academy. This is obviously incredibly screwed up. This locks them into terrible careers, even or like incredibly mid careers, even because you are taking them in with no prospect of actually fielding them. You're only taking them in with the prospect of like actually not having other people field them. Why is this? And it's obviously incredibly bad for their career. What's the counterfactual? Obviously, firstly, clubs have less, insofar as clubs have less like powerful abilities, they have less incentive to obviously act in such terrible ways. But secondly, people can also just leave in the cases where they observe that clubs are never going to field them. And this is particularly important because this is the prime of their career. And oftentimes, smaller teams might want you. It's just that the bigger clubs might not want you, insofar as this is obviously like a really competitive environment. So and your talents might just be a lot better suited to a lot of smaller teams. Now, at the very least, you're actually able to join them. You have a shot at a career when you normally wouldn't have. I'll take opening for that.
If elite academies accept more players, more young people get the opportunity to access this training that eventually allows them to join professional clubs.
Yeah, but what I just said was that the way that a lot of elite academies take them in is not with the incentive of even fielding them. But the second thing I'm going to explain, or like my third extension, is going to directly tackle that even more. Now, let's talk about the players who do actually have a shot of making it onto the team. However, the problem is that it's incredibly uncertain whether or not this shot and this chance actually manifest. The problem is that a lot of clubs can but will not necessarily take you. Why is this the case? Because if you take a look at the current team, realize that the current team in the club is oftentimes incredibly strong sometimes. But secondly, young people have to compete with veterans who go onto the market. Realize that oftentimes these are rookies, these are gambles, and in comparison, a lot of these veterans have a lot more accumulated fame, have a lot more guaranteed shot at being a good prospect. This means that you're constantly left waiting on the sideline, waiting on the benches, waiting for a shot to just open up when this is something that is not guaranteed. Think about how a lot of F1 drivers, even if they're F2 champions, they just don't end up on the team. They are oftentimes forever stuck being a reserve driver. This is a terrible fate, considering that these people obviously really, really want to enter the team. They dedicated millions of dollars and years of their life to actually getting this. On the counterfactual, realize that other clubs can take you, and for similar reasons that I mentioned, other clubs probably do want to take you. And this is incredibly important because you can also pressure your own club to take you. This is just incredibly important in breaking OO's guaranteed pipeline. We prove why other clubs are incredibly why your own club does not have your best interest in mind. But very lastly, I'm going to quickly explain why exactly the contracts are likely to be not good. And note, this is about the club, not about the academy, so we think that this is just far more significant. The very simple observation is that once you notice that they can't enter other clubs, they can do things like give you poorer pay, but also things like long-term contracts. And this is obviously incredibly terrible because sports usually they usually prefer year-by-year contracts because the meta changes so quickly. Insofar, if you lock these people into teams, they oftentimes end up with an incredibly uncertain future. This is something that is incredibly uncertain, and this is something that's just far worse than the counterfactual. So proud.
Thank you so much for that speech, and I'd like to invite the op member to begin their team's case.
Can somebody confirm that I'm visible and audible?
You're so good.
Okay, thank you. I will take verbal POIs, please. I don't look at the chat, so feel free to unmute. Speech will begin in 3, 2, 1. And I'm going to run an incredibly simple extension. I'm just going to explain that we get better investment in development in youth academies when you don't have this ban, because there's an incentive to actually engage in these sorts of things. And at the end of my speech, I'm going to explain why we outweigh OO's version of this, which mistakens what the problem in the status quo is. So I want to begin by actually giving the proper characterization of what youth academies are. Unlike what you hear from OO, and unfortunately, I do have to do a bit of a knife here, they are not broke. They're incredibly profit-driven, and they favor rich clients over the best candidates that could probably be the actual best athletes. On the other hand, The incentives of clubs is entirely talent driven because all they care about is sourcing the best players to eventually play on their teams because the way they make money is not by collecting tuition fees from parents, but rather having their players be the best so they can actually sell jerseys, so they can actually win championships, etc. So the change in this debate is that when the agreement is made, these clubs all of a sudden become incredibly involved in these youth academies. How do they get involved? Number one, they start introducing their own oversight into the rules and selection processes of these academies. Oftentimes, they make changes to make it a lot more meritocratic. For example, making it less about interviews of the parents and more about the sheer raw performance of the athlete child. But also, oftentimes, they broaden the scope of the funnel from which they're actually recruiting these children. Because oftentimes youth academies, when left alone, are only going to recruit from certain circles that they know is going to bear clients that are wealthy enough to pay their tuition fees. They're going to go to things like AAU tournaments, which have extremely expensive registration fees, because they know that's where people who are actually willing to pay those tuition are going to be. They don't go to more middle class leagues or free leagues, or even in extreme cases, venture out to the favelas in Brazil to actually find the best players because they know that there's no profit incentive to do that. But secondly, this changes when you bring in the club into this agreement because they have the incentive to actually venture out and do that talent recruiting. There will be more on this later. But secondly, they often bring money into this, and that means that you can do things like subsidize better equipment and coaching, but it also allows for more scholarships. The reason why they're likely to do this is because they know this is a true tried and tested method. Ronaldo and Messi both came from poor backgrounds, but went to big academies on scholarships. The Barcelona Youth Academy even paid for Messi's human growth hormone treatment because they saw that he was so talented. The third thing they do is that they introduce knowledge sharing into this academy. So beyond just giving money, which these academies probably already have a lot of, what these clubs now do is that they take their professional main coaches and take them to spend time with the children from these academies. And this is incredibly important. They also do things like allow scrimmages for the academy players to play against the actual professional club players. And the reason why this is hugely impactful is because now you are gaining exposure to a high level of competition that you wouldn't have anywhere else. Yes, you are playing among the elites of your age, but the elites of the elites are the ones who end up going to play in the actual pro leagues, and those are the people you have chances to scrimmage with. Those are the people you have mentorships with. So this is an incredibly important factor in how you develop as a player. Why does this go away with a ban? Because there's no longer an incentive on behalf of the clubs to make such investments or to share such trade secrets. A couple of reasons for this. One, you could just completely sink this cost when the player from this academy ultimately just gets swept up by some other team which has more money to offer in a higher contract. And now all of that talent development has gone down the drain. But also, you risk trade secrets getting leaked because when you actually do all the things which I've described, send the main coach down to the campus, scrimmage with them, and show them your playbook. Now all of this things can get leaked. Your playbook can get leaked when they go to this other team. They can tell you about, the bad habits that your players have, which they only learned about through scrimmaging with them, etc. So you're less likely to actually spend one-on-one time with the team and with the youth academy. But thirdly, there's a huge opportunity cost because if you know that there isn't enough of a guarantee of ROI on these investments in academies, then you'd rather spend this money on, paying in exorbitantly high contracts to establish players who are already in the league but just play on other teams or your main team coaching, etc. So there's less investment going into actually developing talent from a young age. The impacts of this are threefold. Number one, talent sourcing gets a lot worse on their side of the house. Like I said, oftentimes this just means that the scope from which you source from is going to be a lot more narrow because you only want to source from rich kids who are going to pay you. The alternative is that you have more of an incentive to broaden. And this obviously operates on a spectrum. In some cases, it's just like giving more scholarships to slightly poorer children from the same country. But in the other side of the spectrum, it looks like actually opening entirely new campuses in areas in North Africa, which we are increasingly seeing European football clubs do. This is why there's a Barcelona Academy campus in Morocco, which is where they got Lamine Yamal from before he showed himself to be so good that he got transferred to the main campus in Spain. You never would have accessed that sort of talent if you didn't have the incentive to go and recruit and go to build academies in poor countries where you aren't going to be able to collect high tuition fees. The impact of this is that one, you get better talent, which just makes the league more exciting, and this is better for the fans. But also, you now provide access for disenfranchised players to actually access the big leagues and actually get their chance to move to Europe, to go to the big leagues, to make these salaries. But secondly, development on their side gets worse for the simple reason that you no longer have access to all of these one-on-one moments, professional caliber coaching and practice, which I've already mentioned. The third thing is that we can flip their claim on competition. Oftentimes, academies are not guarantees of good talent. Sometimes it will spawn out of lower tier academies because of geographical constraints or whatever. In these cases, offering the highest contract salary is usually what actually is the main culprit of entrenching elite teams to be the elite teams, which means that contract protection is likely going to be the actual best solution to that. Now, I'm going to explain why we way over OO, but first of all, I want to take that POI.
So do you think they're more likely to sign exclusive deals with established agencies in privileged areas or build agencies from the ground up and scout, as you mentioned?
They're going to do some of both, but that only happens when you actually give clubs the incentive to build these out. Private youth academies don't have the incentive to build out from the ground academies in poor areas, but we have literally seen that this is something that clubs are willing to do because they know that oftentimes there's a lot of talent there. I'm going to explain this more in my way. Why do we weigh over OO? 3 reasons. Number one, their mechanism for the improvement of athlete careers is that you get these guaranteed contracts, but this isn't the case. Just because of this agreement, it does not mean that you're guaranteed to have a contract with that team. It just means that once you're good enough to be offered a contract by any team, this team has priority. We tell you that we actually develop these players better because of all the resources that they now have beyond just money. So they're more likely to get accepted somewhere, period. But secondly, we address more vulnerable actors, people from disenfranchised regions who have less access to these things. And even if it is the case that these do not end up being star players, they at least get access to the youth academy and get good enough to maybe go to some like B tier or C tier league. And even that would be life-changing for them. Even that salary, even being able to move to Europe and send their kids to European schools and get those visas is going to be incredibly important. But also for the people who do become stars, they often use their high salaries to give remittances back to their communities and build basketball courts in Cameroon, build basketball courts and basketball camps in Greece in the case of Giannis Antetokounmpo. Moreover, this provides representation for people of minority groups who can actually see people like them on the world stage playing for the best teams in the world. Very, very proud.
Hello, can I be seen and heard? Can I be seen and heard?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. All right. All right. Starting my speech in 3, sorry, 2, 1. CG is the only side in this round to actually prove to you how we break the hierarchy and stagnancy that currently exists between agencies. This directly fits CEO, who doesn't listen to our speech because we explain to you how exactly we actually scout into these underdeveloped regions that they want to talk about. Ashley explains that we break hierarchies because there's an increased desire to scout. The reason for this is that there's currently an ability for you to have certainty over who you're going to employ. If you are a large club, you know that the agency that you're currently going to is going to give you the players that's going to become your talent pipeline. If you need a goalie, you can train up that goalie from the ground. If you need a striker, you can train up the striker from the ground. Any gaps in your team can be filled up as a result. All of this means that large clubs have no desire to expand beyond their comfort zones because they already guaranteed players from these places in the first place, and they can mold them into who they actually want to be. Under our side, when you ban these forms of advanced agreements, you uniquely reduce certainty over who you get. And before their side says, but oh, isn't it the case that you can just be a big club and buy over these players anyways? The issue is there are other big clubs that are competing for you in these large agencies as well. You don't know if you're going to get this star goalie and star striker because other clubs could outbid you for these players in the first place. Therefore, the lack of certainty as to who you're going to get and the lack of certainty with regards to your talent pipeline forces you to scout into other regions and other leagues because you know that these places are the only way you're actually able to guarantee ability to get these players because of the first mover's advantage, because you're able to expand into these leagues in the first place and get out the talent from these regions positions that other clubs aren't touching. Therefore, it is uniquely under our side that you create the need to go to agencies and you create the need to care about other leagues in scouting. This flips OO as well, where they just assert that scouting is a one-off thing. Clearly, this is an assertion. You can just judge off match stats. You can judge off like rounds. Like you don't need to just go down there and judge it off a like 190-minute game. There are many other ways you can scout and get information of these players. Therefore, at the end of the day, we get significantly better scouting. Notice this doesn't fall into the issue of OG, which is the hierarchy that he explains to is predicated on the best talents going to the biggest agencies, as OO rightly points out. We explain how even if this hierarchy in terms of best players going to biggest agencies remains, it is under our side where we get more people to go to these smaller agencies, even though the best talent is still concentrated in the largest places. Therefore, we explain the desire to expand outwards, and this beats our CEO. Second extension that we explained is how big clubs actually engage with academies in the first place. The issue with OG is at the end at the assertion that players are naive and coerced into bad contracts. OO identifies that this isn't exclusive and it isn't mechanized properly. We actually map out how this talent pipeline is malicious. It's because of a twofold problem. One is that players want to go to these biggest agencies because of the talent, the prestige that's associated with that. They want to have a chance to play for Liverpool and Manchester United one day, and so they flock to the agencies that have the guaranteed pipeline towards these clubs. The issue here is that the best talents are sucked up into these agencies, but clubs also have the same vested incentive to keep these talents away from other clubs and competitors. That explains that many of these clubs sign players en masse and then don't give them any form of game time, don't give them any form of attention. This is why it's so bad, and this outweighs the facilities point that comes out from OG. Because worse facilities just means you stagnate as a player, but that's like not an independent hub at the end of the day. What happens when you don't get game time is your career is killed. As a young player, youth is your advantage. You need to get into the big leagues. You need to have showings that actually guarantees you better contracts in the future. It is uniquely under their side that you lock these players out of game times entirely. Their careers are killed because no one watches their games, no one wants to employ them afterwards. They languish on the backbenches of clubs and earn pittances. This therefore means that careers are killed under their side, and that is the largest harm that actually explains why players are going to be fucked over. Let's engage with each house. The specific thing that CEO said, and that's quite derivative of OO, is that he just explained how their individual academies are not going to be benefited and what is going to be a lack of funding. There's a lot of explanation as to how the academy benefits, as you will hear from MO, but there's not a lot of explanation as to why this benefit accrues onto the clubs that they actually explain. Insofar as they don't actually explain this link, this just explains why it generates greater inequality, because it means that the best agencies get these training facilities, get all of this attention, but the smallest clubs don't. The weighing here is incredibly simple. Are you more likely as a large club to sign exclusive deals with established agencies in privileged areas or build agencies from the ground up? Clearly, you are more likely go towards places with a high track record, a historical track record of success, or with players that are already proven to be successful, because these are the places with the most guarantee of return on investment rather than places where significantly more uncertain. Therefore, it is likely the case that their benefit accrues onto the largest of clubs and the largest of agencies. That explains why inequality is increased. The second contention is that you can just train them once you can train them, but like, clearly you can just train them once they join. You can just give them the attention and give them the sport size once they join your club. So this is again inexclusive. The last thing they say is that you get greater amounts of investment into existing players, but this is absurd. Clearly, you invest into players because you want continuity and sustainability. You advance into youth players because you want players for your next team and your next squad and the next few years. So existing players just don't make the mark. That doesn't explain why it's necessarily going to be a substitute. The outweigh is incredibly simple. Their benefits are concentrated on the best players and agencies. We actually explain how we break this hierarchy and increase equity within these places. The best case scenario on both op benches is that small academies get better contracts. But clearly, not only were these small academies less likely to get these exclusive contracts in the first place, but it throws away their ability to get their players into the best leagues that we actually talk about. We are the side that actually benefits these small agencies. Let's deal with OO. The first thing and the cursory observation I want to note at the top of this is that we flip their assertion that big clubs don't want smaller agencies, because we actually explain the mechanism for why this happens. But OO has three arguments. The first is guarantee. But like OO themselves admits that top agencies are still lucrative, so clearly there's still a high guarantee of being employed regardless. Smaller agencies don't have the capacity to sign the contract they describe as much, and so likely the guarantee that these small agencies get is significantly smaller, because no club actually wants to sign with a mid agency or a small agency that doesn't have these reputations. Secondly, you don't sign them all, and this kills their point on guarantee, because clearly even if you're signed, not only are you losing game time and your career is killed, but many of these people languish with these agencies because the big club can only sign that many players at one point in time, which means that many of these people just go without contracts and go without pay, which means that many of these people just lose guarantees because they're so a false promise of being signed into these clubs when they join these agencies. At the end, the way is just simple. The top players lose guarantees, which is their best case scenario, but we never cared about these top players as much as the agencies that we think were more important, the largest scope of majority agencies in the world. Let's go.
If you're from an elite club and you don't get signed by a top professional club, you can just go to other clubs. We are not preventing players from doing that. You get a higher chance of doing so when you were trained at this elite academy in the first place.
Wait, but that's what locked in and priority means. It means that the large club has the priority to sign you, which means that you go to these clubs, which they don't have optionality. Second argument that they have is that you have incentive to give better treatment. But they say it for two reasons that both are a bit silly. The first thing they say is that you want them to succeed. But once you have the contract already, they already succeeded, you already get the money in the bank, you already have the deal. So you don't have an incentive to make them succeed. Beyond that, you just the incentive for them to get into these positions in the first place. The more important thing they say is that you want these players to join. But clearly the competition of why players join agencies in the first place is not the pay, it's the prestige that's associated with it. Because they want to go to Liverpool, they want to get these better contracts in the future. Therefore, even with worse circumstances and worse pay, this just doesn't actually matter. The last thing that O says, and this coming as CEO also co-ops, is that agencies profit because funding to agencies happens. The first thing to know is that agencies profit from the contracts that they sign with big clubs in the first place when players are signed. So they still get money from this and it's far more meritocratic. Secondly, there's still ways to obtain money anyways, and O admits that large agencies exist, so they still have funding, but it also looks like sponsorships. It also looks like good coaches that want to go to these places. It also looks like big teams that want to get their good names into these places and want to get a foot into the door and will still fund these agencies in the first place. Even if they lose out in some investment, they still want to have a chance of signing these players in the first place. Therefore, funding still exists. At the end of the day, we are the only house that's actually honest as to how players are screwed over at these agencies and how exactly small agencies are benefited. O just wants to benefit the largest clubs. We explain equity.
Thanks for that speech. And now I'd like to invite the whip.
Okay, I'll take PIs and chat for me, please. No need to verbally interrupt during my speech. The most important impact in this debate is that you have significantly more academies and significantly poorer areas. So you get new academies that are only formed in the case where a team can monopolize players from that academy. That means that you get jobs in areas like Morocco or Pagoda, which are historically underdeveloped. It also means that players are able to be hired from there, do things like remittances to their families, and make the quality of life better for people on the ground. The first thing I'm going to do is weigh why this impact is the highest in the debate, and then I'm going to explain why we uniquely access it, unlike OO and other teams in the round. First of all, why does it matter the most? It affects the most people simply. That is to say that for each player who's successful, there are lots of players who maybe don't make it into the top leagues, but maybe can make it into the B leagues on our side of the house. There are many coaches, janitors, people who run these types of institutions who are able to get jobs uniquely when new ones are created. And in many cases, this is the difference between people being able to afford a better house for their family or afford a worse house. So even if all of the other teams affect the players who are going to get drafted either way, those players are going to earn many millions of dollars on either side of the house. They will have lives that are altogether considered quite good by the standard of anybody in the real world. And so the vast majority of those people are going to be fine either way. The important impacts then are the people in Greece who are only able to have soccer fields developed by athletes who go abroad and give remittances, the people who only have jobs because of those groups, etc. The ability of those fans to connect with the athletes, which is unique to our sub-house. So why are we able to access this uniquely in a way that O doesn't? O, I think, has two important contributions. The first is this contribution on certainty. I think that this is already highly unclear. As other teams point out, you take a fixed number of players, so it's unclear how reallocating the distribution of that fixed numbers of player changes how the amount of certainty happens, right? The more important claim then from OO is that during the DLO, they have some explanation about why you're likely to get more investment. There are two reasons why this analysis is not sufficient and isn't able to make us derivative. The first thing is they misidentify the problem. So I think that they're wrong that the problem is that academies don't have enough money. We explain that academies do have plenty of money, and GovBench agrees with this, right? So this isn't knife. We're just pointing out that O is susceptible to the good reputation from CG, which is that in many cases, the academies sign players to big teams and get money that way. So they have lots of money, which enables them to do things like pay players, like pay coaches. But the issue then is one of incentive and not one of incentive and location. So in the status quo, we explained that you're able to share one academy. So for example, multiple teams can have a big academy in Paris that they all get players out of. Or you could have a big academy in Rio or London that you all get players out of. The problem then is that the customer is that you have very little incentive to diversify geographically or diversify in terms of the number of clubs you have, because you can all rely on one club and get players out of there because there's no exclusive contract. The second thing is that even if you fully credit O's argument about more investment, the extent of margin that they're able to get is clubs that exist symmetrically have slightly more funding on their side of the house. They never explain to you why you get new clubs or clubs in locations that you don't. But this is a prerequisite to all of our impacting about how you have additional jobs, how you have communities that couldn't previously access soccer now able to access soccer. So in short, you're just not able to credit the mechanisms that they give you to the extent that they actually take the impacts that we're uniquely giving you and weighing as the most important in the round. What do we then explain to you? We explain to you that when clubs are forced to have some when clubs are forced to have some priority over academies, that's to say that I want to have my own academy so I can get people from that academy, there are two important things that happen. The first is you just have more academies. So you can't share academies anymore because you can't just directly bid for players in the same academy. You want to have absolute priority, which means that clubs have incentives to open new academies and open their own academies as opposed to sharing big academies now. So you end up having more academies, which means that there's more accessibility because the academies also compete against each other to be better. So the overall quality of competition gets better. And what this means then is that you also have a high degree of accessibility because these academies are likely to hire new people, have more staff, etc. So all of our job impacts apply in the debate. But second of all, we explained that you're likely to have a higher degree of geographical diversity. And CG is right that there is some degree of startup costs. We don't think that the startup costs are that large or that preventative. But the claim is that in the status quo, it's not worth me opening an academy in Bogota if I think that if there's a good player, another team will just scoop up that good player, and now I've wasted all my money for nothing. So uniquely, there's only an incentive to start developing academies in areas that are less developed, less rich, and have less of a long-term reputation when it gives me an effective monopoly on good players from those areas. And I want to note that there are lots of big cities. There are lots of countries, for example, like Morocco, as Urfaan points out, that have lots of talent, where soccer playing or other types of sports are very popular. And naturally, some people are going to have genetic gifts and be interested in that. And it's only worth you having a long-term development of academies in those areas if it gives you an effective monopoly. So the effect here is that there's a strong incentive for you to invest into underinvested areas because now you can have a monopoly over all of the players that come from there, which means that there's also significantly more accessibility for people who live in those areas. You don't have to move from Colombia to, for example, Mexico to pursue your soccer career. You can stay in your own city, which means that far more people are able to join these academies, which are good. This then means that there's far less cost for the academies. It means that the people who don't succeed professionally didn't have to take on so much debt, so they're far better off. It also means that there's far more ability for people to do things like remittances. We already explained this affects the most number of people and the most vulnerable people, not people who will succeed on either side of the house. Let's then beat GovBench. First of all, on closing government. Closing government says that you're going to have a high degree of stagnancy. Two problems with this. One, if it's on our side of the house, you don't just want any players, you want the best players, which means you have an incentive to diversify the number of geographical inputs that you have, right? If there's some good players from Colombia, some good players from Morocco, then you want to have an academy in both places so that you can scoop up both of those. It's not like you'll be content to just have one academy because soccer or any other sport is competitive activity. You can't just have a group, you can't just have a academy. That's not sufficient. Second of all, we explained that you are less likely to invest into areas if other teams can just scoop up players from there after the fact, whereas now your investment is exclusive, so you have far more incentive. And now and if there's a minimal level of infrastructure, it's often hard to scout. Now you have an incentive to develop the infrastructure in the first place, which means that the scouting is possible. OG.
Yeah, so your margins on inclusivity depend on proving why initial U.S. recruitment from poor countries likely happens often. ROI is often worse than Morocco because the structure, poverty, and natural talent is often very rare. Most clubs probably recognize
this is completely unintuitive and false. Like lots of people grow up playing soccer or other sports. It doesn't require a huge amount of economic like privilege to get started. And then once you're scouted and there's an academy there, you can be developed. Also, the point is just that this is a massive numbers game. Like if you are the first academy to open it, if you're the first group to open an academy in Bogota, you now access a market of like 4 million people. So even if there's a 1 in like 2 million chance of a really good player coming from there, you now could just scoop them up. So numerically, this doesn't make sense. The second contribution from CG is just that you bench players. One, many leagues have a limitation on the number of players that you can hire exactly for this reason. So there's internal incentives to stop this. Two, these contracts maximum last like 2 years. So you're just not benching them their entire career. But three, it's pretty common for players to be benched initially anyway. Only the very best players get played, but the very best players are probably going to get played symmetrically because they're very good. So there's no incentive to bench them. On OG, we explained that one, you're likely to increase the degree of equality between different academies because there's incentive to invest into your own academy. Two, we explained that players are probably fine on either side of the house. And their stuff on competition only works for the very best players who have lots of bids, but many players don't have that many bids, so they only have 1 or 2 choices anyway. And lastly, we explained that there's significantly more competition because there's ability for players to go different places rather than the status quo, where the best clubs just scoop up all the best players.
Great. Thanks so much, everyone, for that debate. I'll be back in about 10 to 15 minutes. You can stay in this breakout room, and good luck.
Thank you for the debate.
Okay, cool. So, um, thank you very much, everyone, for that excellent debate. Truly very, very high quality. I think even just discussing or thinking about the teams that were maybe at the bottom at times, I think should have been on top. I think it was a really high quality debate. I also think that by way of general feedback, there's not actually much I can offer. The only piece of general feedback I have is potentially just a knowledge gap that some teams maybe demonstrated at times. So I kind of encourage everyone to maybe read up on all the different leagues that exist in different sports, and especially the more common sports, and how they actually reflect themselves in different countries. Because I think cross-border wise, this debate could have done a little bit more. And additionally, I think the use of more common examples or more examples in general would have assisted people mechanistically and also in determining what the most important impacts in the debate were. So, in what I thought was an extremely difficult decision to make, and I think that the ballot reflects how high quality this debate was. So in that way, I guess everyone's a winner. I gave the debate as a closing half, the first to closing opposition, the second to closing government, the third to opening opposition, and the fourth to opening government. So let's start with the opening half. What I'll firstly do is simply explain the issue of youth success and whether or not they succeed contract wise and sports wise, and then I'll talk to the second issue, which opening government does a pretty good job of positioning, which is the quality of the contract with respect to the players' welfare. So in the first issue of player success, I think opening opposition does a slightly better job here. They explain that it's kind of hard to succeed and there are issues with internal competitions, and so internal competition within the youth academy, and so it's just easier to get your guaranteed pipeline into a team or into a club. Where I'm not sure what level of league or what level of league these clubs are extracting young people from, extracting young people into, but I think that opening opposition kind of more clearly explains that these people will be employed at the end of the day. I want to note that there's a very good question that is raised by opening government at Deputy Prime Minister, which is what is the benefit of being in a club? Like, it's not necessarily clear that people should be these elite sports stars, or it's not even clear that they'll even be at the elite level. I think opening opposition lacks analysis there. But I think even though this is a really great question to raise and questions the position of this argument, that the reason why I favored this, or the reason why I thought this argument was important, was for two main reasons. The first is because the actor is largely choosing this. So these set of people who are, opting into sports and doing really well at sports and maybe get scouted or care to be scouted are often opting in themselves. And opening opposition does explain this earlier in their case, which doesn't really receive a direct response. Secondly, I think in comparison to the other teams in the debate, especially the closing teams that raise really powerful argumentation, that those arguments are about the success in these leagues. And so insofar as I think that those arguments are more persuasive in the debate, the opening teams that interact best with the question of whether or not these players will succeed, as I'll explain why the success of those players succeeding is important later in this adjudication. And I think it was kind of clear throughout the debate. I think the players' success is kind of important. And so the mechanisms that opening opposition provide are kind of successful here. They explain that there's a little bit more funding as a result of feeling more safe as a club to invest in youth academies. And I think they also talk about how trainer feedback means that it's not impossible for you to succeed in getting a contract. Let's turn then to the question of better contracts. Here, opening government basically explains that these clubs don't compete and they are not innovating because they can basically have a monopoly of a set of people who come into their clubs. And so there's no incentive to improve their quality of life. There's no incentive to make sure that they have very good training. This is a fine mechanism, I think a quite well-made argument, but I think opening opposition explains it. Firstly, this is exceptionally hard to do. So, yes, I think it is possible that people can go into these clubs and pick the clubs that are best for them. But the question is, will they actually be able to enter those clubs that they prefer? It's not clear that they're going to select the clubs that are best for them. And I think that the reason is simply because of all the reasons opening opposition gives for why, for a lot of young people, it's actually kind of hard to get to the skill level where you have the optionality. Because, if you're competing against so many people, if it's hard to get scouted properly and scouted well, if it's hyper competitive, if it's also such that you have to give up the rest of your life, or like for example, school and stuff like that, then for that reason, I think it's kind of hard to be able to build the skills to be to be in a position where you have the leverage and the power asymmetry to select what clubs you go into. So the question of whether or not you can select the clubs that you want is actually in doubt. Secondly, I think there's a presumption by opening government, which is a fine claim, but I think maybe needs a little bit more work. And I think I might have to enter the debate in order to credit this, which is the claim that, well, smaller clubs have better, have better treatment, or clubs which have a lower threshold for skill treat their players better. I think opening opposition questions this kind of well, where they explain, well, if you're a big team, if you're a large team, you largely have better training, and so if I think that they have more resources, more capital, it's not necessarily clear that the lower teams or any other team that is not super powerful, that where a lot of the talent is concentrated, and a lot of the clubs that are able to monopolize more youth academies, any clubs outside of that, I'm not sure are going to be so much better for the stakeholders we're talking about here. So simply, I'm saying I think opening government's material is very good, but at times I think there's a question over whether or not this will actually occur and whether or not this is actually a good thing if you think a little bit more about it. So for that reason, I think opening government opening opposition, sorry, on those two most important issues in the opening half is able to get ahead. Let's talk about closing government then. Their extension is they have a few things, but I'm just going to skip to the most important one just for now, which is the one about player welfare and the quality of contracts. Here they extend on their opening in a, I think, slightly more grounded way, where they basically explain that, well, in the status quo, you don't want to give your rivals human capital, even if that human capital is at the middling level. So that means that you sign people or sign lots and lots of contracts to deprive them of people to train and to deprive them of people to build up into off the bench and onto the field. So what this basically means is that there are large clubs, and I presume it's a very large and very powerful clubs, and this is quite intuitive. They are the ones who monopolize a lot of contracts, and that means the set of people who are just deprived from other clubs, they basically have to sit on the bench and they don't get to train as much. I would note closing government's claim here, I think, is at times a little bit exaggerated. I don't necessarily think they prove that these people never train or never ever get an opportunity. I agree, maybe they don't get to play a lot of the games, but I do think maybe they improve to some degree, and I'll explain why closing opposition's responses are very, very strong. But irrespective, this extension itself, I think, is quite persuasive. And let's compare them then to their opening. Compared to opening government's claim about innovation, I'm just not sure clubs are actually affected by the competition mechanism as soundly as opening government says. As I mentioned before, it's not clear that these players will have as much leverage or power in order to inspire that competition mechanism. And I'm not sure that clubs have, what specifically clubs will do in order to innovate. I think opening government at times assumes that clubs have poor treatment of players, which I'm very, very willing to believe. But I just needed structural reasons for why these clubs would take you to the max and hurt you and cause you damage, such that you are not able to be a functioning player or be a worse playing player. For that reason, I think that the question of innovation has a question mark over it, and so for that reason, closing government's more sound mechanism of, well, clubs have a market incentive to buy up resources and real estate in terms of human capital. I think that's slightly more certain. So for that reason, I think the impact from CG just lands a little stronger for me. Then I think that the claim from if to the extent that I believe opening government's material, which is very persuasive, but closing government explains that their material is logically prior. So they simply explain that in order to have high quality contracts and in order to have a high quality career such that opening government's benefits can be activated, you need to first be able to tap into those benefits. So yes, you may get some training, but do you get the best training in your team? Do you get the same training as everyone else in your team? And yes, you may get some. Another question is, do you even get to train? Do you even get on the field? It's just a question of all the benefits that opening government has. First, the question must be answered. Can you actually tap into the assets of this team that you are so happily entering? And I think closing government questions that a little bit, engages in that question uniquely, and that question I think is logically prior and therefore a little bit more important in the debate. Then let's compare closing government's material to opening oppositions. So opening opposition's material does a really good job of establishing how players are more likely to, how players find it hard to succeed without any, without clubs having the certainty that those players would come into their clubs. I think that's a fine mechanism. But what closing government does at the end is I think they attack the claim about you even being taken into clubs in the first place. Like, I'm not sure opening opposition proves that yes, you may have the priority over a certain youth academy, but I need a question of what's the quantum of people who are leaving that youth academy with a contract into that team. And I think that closing government questions the quality of those contracts in a different way to opening government, and also questions how many people even get bought up in a way or scooped up in a way that is desirable. And I also think that closing government questions the practical imperative for opening opposition's case. Like, is it actually that hard to scout people? You can do things like turn to match stats. You can turn to things like talk to people and get feedback from them, such that you understand those players. So I think that the ability, if it is true that we want to scout people in higher quality ways, closing government suggests some practical ways that we can work around that. So the imperative that opening opposition sets is substantially mitigated by closing government here. Let's bring in closing opposition. So their extension is that, well, that there is an investment into young youth academies, which is higher, just slightly better. I think the impacting is just very good. Here they explain that, well, you have more certainty or have a little bit more confidence in investing in youth academies in more diverse and also poorer and also intercontinental places, which I think is a pretty good benefit for a wide set of people. They also do a little bit more impacting in terms of the set of stakeholders who are affected in this debate and go way beyond the players who are affected, but also the support staff or the tangential set of people who benefit from this part of the economy. So I think the impacting from closing opposition is quite sophisticated in the debate. And I also think their mechanism is at times potentially similar, but I think distinct enough. They simply, but the most persuasive part or the most unique part is where they explain that it's not even just like you're not even sure if you want to hire someone because it's not even I think the claim around how some clubs engage in training with the youth academy, and it's not just about looking at the youth academy from afar. They actually drill down into how some of these youth academies and clubs work in specifically, and what their contracts actually look like. It sometimes looks like training those kids directly, and I think that that's a really good mechanism because it talks about how actually you won't invest in that training as much anymore, or you won't give them those skills anymore because you're afraid of leaks. And I think this is a unique mechanism. I don't necessarily think it's the winning mechanism in the debate, but it's unique enough that I think that this argument about certainty and the ability to set up youth academies or invest in youth academies, it's distinct enough. I think it's kind of persuasive. Let's compare them to the rest of the debate then. So in comparison to opening government, I think that so actually firstly I'll compare them to closing government first. So closing government has some pretty good responses to closing opposition's case, and some of that mitigation from whip is kind of good. So, for example, well, you're not going to go to places where it's uncertain. You're just going to set up in places where there's actual statistics of people and youth academies, and set up youth academies that are actually going to, in areas that are actually kind of good. But I think that this kind of ignores the asymmetry CO is explaining. I don't think CO proves that all clubs are going to now are now just going to invest wholly into setting up new youth academies in different countries. I think they're just simply explaining that the incentive to do so asymmetrically falls under closing opposition side, simply because the monopoly effect of having those people to yourself as a club means that you would set them up. And I think this is the claim from I think this claim from the closing opposition team is made slightly more specifically, and with regard to how these youth academies and how these clubs work, they use a lot of examples and they use the mechanisms of what they actually kind of look like in order to uniquely make this claim. So I don't think closing government defeats the argument that's the closing opposition is making. They simply mitigate it to an extent that I don't think it's going to take that argument out. I also think that the claim about benching is kind of well mitigated by CO. So when CG is like, well, you'll be benched, I think CO is the best. CO, the op whip does a pretty good job of explaining, well, it's not clear that you'll be benched all the time. And I'm also kind of questioning whether or not that benching is as significant as I say. And CO, I think, is the only team to basically weaponize just how long these contracts exist for. Yes, they exist for quite a significant amount of time, but those contracts get renewed, they change. So I think regard to how contract law works assists CO's case here. So for that reason, I think CO, a good judge, I think, would give it to either CG or CO. But in this circumstance, for those reasons, I gave it to CO. Then in comparing CO to opening opposition, I think that it's the comparison about youth academies being broke or not. This is not a knife. It's just a different characterization. I just don't know. My feedback to any team in the debate is maybe don't call it a knife, but I'm willing to accept these two characterizations. OO's material is quite good, but I think CO does a pretty good job of pointing out where the change in the debate is most significant. So they explain where when we're setting up a new youth academy, that doesn't just have impacts on the kids themselves or the young people themselves, but the support staff as well. They also explain where these youth academies are set up, which I think is very useful and specific material. So simply just the attention to detail and specificity in the way in which these youth academies are invested in, I think, means that I'm more persuaded by the op bench through CO's material itself. And so for that reason, I think CO kind of edges out OO here. This is also another pretty close split. Then in comparison with opening government, I think at the end of the day, what happens is the contracts maybe get better under opening government side, but I think that the question of how much better they get, given that I needed a little bit more work on all the mechanisms I described before coming at in the opening half, which I had struggle in, determining how OG won against OO there. I think that same principle kind of applies to CO here as well. So closing opposition's material just has, as I mentioned before, a slightly more certain, margin of change. Whereas with respect to opening government, I think that change is a little bit more speculative. And so for that reason, I think I would prefer closing opposition's case. So that's how I saw the debate. I'm more than willing to take questions, and thank you so much for what I thought was, a super, super high quality, performance. Everyone did super well. Thank you so much.